Roger, I know you've attended a number of conventions. Have you ever attended a conclave before?
I can't say I have, and I must say that the outcome of this conclave was somewhat surprising. Now, when you understand that 80% of the cardinals who had the ability to vote were handpicked by Pope Francis, uh, the outcome, meaning the conclave producing a moderate to progressive pope, is really not surprising. I would have preferred uh, Cardinal Erdo or Cardinal Sarah. Those were my emotional favorites. But as you know, I wrote a couple of long pieces, came on your show, did an in depth analysis, kind of the horse race for Pope. But I have to admit that Robert Provost, now Pope Leo, was not on my list. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. He is clearly very solid on some of the church's traditional positions. For example, he doesn't buy into any of this gender nonsense. He's solid on the right to life, on the priesthood to continue to be maintained for men. But I don't like the fact that he is not speaking from the throne of Peter, but just speaking in a pastoral sense. He's opposed President Trump and Vice President Vance on the very important issue of illegal immigrants. He seems to favor an open borders policy, which is hard to reconcile with the fact that, of course, the Vatican, where he is going to live and work, has very high walls and very tight security. So it's hard to reconcile those two.
Oh, Roger, and certainly security was paramount when my brother and I were there, as well as the Human Events team. Producer Russ came out from Phoenix there in St. Peter's Square. And one of the things that I think that, we've learned just from being on the ground and pulling some sources together was one of the big rumors going around was this question of Cardinal Parolin. So Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, actually has to be seen whether or not he'll be staying on in that capacity, was widely seen as the front runner by the media and many others going into the conclave. Yet what we're being told, and again, I have this from a source in the Vatican, that once the conclave doors were closed, that Parolin immediately began championing the candidacy of Prevost. That he knew he wouldn't have the votes. He knew that he was too publicly associated with Francis to win over the conservatives. And so almost immediately, once they realized he didn't have the votes, they may have done one test ballot and then took one vote. Because remember, Roger, this was only the fourth round of ballots, which is very fast. I believe fast when that puff of white smoke went up on day two, only 24 hours after the opening of the conclave, the entire city of Rome was rushing to the square. No one could believe that it was picked so quickly. And from what I'm hearing on the inside, is that it was the liberal progressive Parolin pushing for Cardinal Prevost. And you mentioned, of course, the issue of illegal immigration. And I just go back to saying that this has been a huge revenue driver for the Vatican and so many others through groups like Catholic Charities and others, because while they get the signups in Latin America and in Africa, when it comes to the money, which is currently going into those, and people say, oh, the Vatican is so rich. Well, yes and no. They're still derived off of revenue from donors and parishioners going to church. It has been running low in past years. They have huge cash flow issues. That's why they needed the CCP deal to bail them out a couple of years back under Francis McCarrick, the now disgraced former Cardinal McCarrick, and of course, Parolin himself. And so a lot of those money issues could be one of the reasons that they wanted, number one, turn on the illegal immigration revenue pipeline yet again, and number two, choose an American who can directly go for that big American money.
Jack, I agree with that. I think, frankly, Cardinal Parolin's candidacy was damaged by some of these financial irregularities that were
Yes.
raised very deftly and at exactly the right time by an American bishop of Lugano at a very key time. And I agree with you. I think this is an appeal for money. In the meantime, two things I found extraordinarily amusing. The way some Catholics flipped out when President Trump put out a picture of himself in papal vestments. Some people can't take a joke. Some people, I think, might have been waiting for orange smoke to come from the Sistine Chapel. Trump is not a Catholic. It was just humor, but some people took it very, very seriously. Well, I'm offended. Well, I'm offended by the fact that Pope Francis accommodated the Chinese communists, basically agreed to let them veto who could be a bishop in China, because accommodation with evil, Jack, is evil. I'm offended by the fact that Pope Francis brought Cardinal McCarrick, who was a vicious pedophile, out of retirement and gave him a position as a key advisor inside the Vatican. That offended me. So, people need to lighten up. In this case, I am also amused by the fact that the Pope's brother, Lou, appears to not only be MAGA, not only be a supporter of President Trump and a harsh critic of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, but he also seems to be fully awake on the question of Richard M. Nixon and Watergate. He reposted a great meme in which someone pointed out that Nixon only erased a 13-minute tape, while Hillary Clinton erased 33,000 classified emails. She basically destroyed them with beach blit and a hammer when they were under subpoena. So he's red-pilled on the question of Nixon and Watergate as well. Found that very amusing.
When it really comes down to this, I do think that the progressives, my concern is that the progressives will want to use this Pope and the tweets that we've already seen being very critical of J.D. Vance, President Bukele in El Salvador, and President Trump on the issue of deportation and illegal immigration, to use this as potentially a wedge to break up the huge Catholic voting bloc that swung for President Trump and brought him into office across the Rust Belt. And by the way, something that I'm sure Catholic convert J.D. Vance, our vice president, would want to use should he run, as I think is widely expected, for president himself in his own right, as President Trump is likely term limited to right now. So, Roger, how should the president manage his relations with the Holy See here?
First of all, I think people need to see this in some historical perspective. It's important to recognize that working class ethnic Catholic votes are the bedrock of every Republican presidential victory since 1968. When those Catholic voters vote for the Republican nominee, as they did for Nixon, as they did for Reagan, as they did for Trump, we win. When we lose those voters, we lose. The Pope is going to have a very hard time convincing working class Catholic voters in the United States that open borders are a good idea, that high taxes are a good idea, that profligate federal spending is a good idea. So I think, in all honesty, Catholics understand the difference between when the Pope speaks as Catholic or speaks on matters of faith and church doctrine, and when the Pope expresses what are in fact, really, in essence, political opinions. It is not going to change the views of, I think, a majority of non-progressive, working class, more conservative Catholics, because the Pope thinks that illegal immigration is a great idea. If I were the Pope, I'd be more concerned about what the president thinks than the president should be concerned about what the Pope thinks in terms of the way it impacts American voters.
Well, and this is a huge, huge point because, as I've said before, the antagonism towards the president, which we clearly saw from Pope Francis. And, I know there's a lot of Catholics out there who try to say, oh, Jack, I know political speech when I see political speech. I kind of do it for a living. And so he was obviously playing politics with President Trump. And now he's certainly, there are a number of other issues where he stood with Catholic orthodoxy, which I absolutely do support, and I've seen that Pope Leo XIV has as well. But Roger, that really is the danger then, because the media would love for the new president to get into this feud with the new Pope when the two men, as far as I know, have never even spoken.
Yeah, but Jack, the truth is, I don't think Americans vote on the basis of religion, in all honesty. And there are, for example, obviously there's some extremely liberal progressive Catholics, but beyond that, I honestly don't think that religious issues are what going to divide. Those voters who are pro-life are going to continue to support Donald Trump, for example. Uh, Beyond that, it's good. Progressivism is going to be a very tough sell for this Pope, and for people to think that the Pope is viewed as a political figure in this country, he's not. If he had, then the huge incursions among Catholics that Trump made in the last two elections, the last three elections, really, would never have taken place. So even with Pope Francis attacking the president, it did not impact the Catholic vote here in the United States in 2024. It didn't work. Why? Because you cannot convince any voter, any sane voter, that having illegal immigrants, dangerous in some cases, actually members of gangs, is a good public policy idea.